One of the oldest influence tactics in history isn't violence, and it isn't intimidation, it isn't even deception, it's uncertainty. If I can make you question what you know, you'll begin looking to me for certainty. Notice the trick? I don't necessarily have to convince you that I'm right. Sometimes it's enough to convince you that you are no longer sure whether you are right. That's all uncertainty needs. It doesn't have to build my argument. It only has to weaken yours. And that is why this tactic has survived for centuries. Negotiators use it, and advertisers use it, salespeople use it, politicians and especially con artists use it. Anybody trying to influence another human being eventually discovers the same thing. A person who's uncertain is easier to lead than a person who's prepared. And that's the important distinction. Prepared, not confident. Confident people can be wrong. Prepared people can demonstrate why they believe what they believe. There's a world of difference, so yes, this works. Ignoring that reality, well, it doesn't make the tactic disappear. It just simply makes you more vulnerable to it. So, how do we never fall victim to those tactics? The answer isn't to become louder, it isn't to become more confident. And it certainly isn't to assume we're too intelligent to be manipulated. The answer is procedure. The answer is rule 1.
Tell them how to bring those sons of bitches down.
Rule 1. Ask only questions you already have the receipt for. At first glance, that sounds completely backwards. Shouldn't questions be how we discover information? Sometimes. But that's not what Rule 1 is for. Rule 1 is about investigation. Before you ask the question, read the transcript. Check the quotation and find the original source. Read the surrounding context. Look for evidence that contradicts your own position, and try to prove yourself wrong before somebody else does. Only then ask the question. Notice what Rule 1 has just done? Your confidence no longer comes from personality, it comes from preparation. That's the difference. Confident people can be wrong. Prepared people can show you why they believe what they believe. Preparation is difficult to shake because it isn't built on certainty. It's built on verification. Think about any profession where mistakes are expensive. Pilots use checklists and engineers inspect their work. Surgeons review scans before operating and detectives verify evidence before making an arrest. None of them rely on confidence alone. They rely on procedure. Rule 1 is exactly that, a procedure. Not because procedures are glamorous, because procedures work. That's why Rule 1 isn't about sounding intelligent, it's about refusing to guess. Now compare the two. The tactic creates uncertainty, but Rule 1 creates preparation. The tactic attacks confidence, and Rule 1 removes the need for confidence. One encourages dependence, and the other encourages verification. One asks you to trust certainty, and the other asks you to inspect evidence. That's why they aren't opposites. They're solving different problems. The tactic is trying to influence your thinking. Rule 1 is trying to strengthen it. And preparation doesn't argue with uncertainty, preparation outlives it. Rule 1 isn't there to help you win an argument. It's there to stop you from beginning one before you've earned the right. If you've done the work, if you followed the receipts, and if you tested your own assumptions, then uncertainty has far less room to grow. Not because you've become more confident, because you become more prepared. Preparation is a quiet advantage that rarely attracts attention until the moment that it's needed. Learn Rule 1. Everything begins there. Now, once uncertainty has done its job, a second tactic often appears: shift the burden. Instead of defending the original claim, the conversation suddenly becomes about whether you can explain it. The claim quietly slips into the background. The spotlight moves onto you. You've probably heard it before. Well, you tell me. At first, that sounds perfectly reasonable. After all, if you're questioning something, shouldn't you be able to explain why? Sometimes yes. But notice what's happened. The original claim has quietly stopped being examined. Instead, now you are the one being examined. The burden is moved. Instead of asking whether the evidence supports the claim, the conversation becomes a test of your memory, your confidence, your ability to perform under pressure, and that's a completely different question. The claim hasn't become true simply because you struggled to explain why you questioned it. But if you weren't prepared, it certainly feels that way. This tactic works because most people confuse confidence with knowledge. They assume that hesitation means you're wrong, and certainty means that they're right. Neither assumption is reliable. A confident person can be mistaken, and a hesitant person can be correct. Performance isn't evidence, but in conversation, people often mistake one for the other. That is why this tactic has survived for centuries, not because it's dishonest, because it exploits something deeply human. When challenged unexpectedly, most people panic. So, how do we never fall victim to that tactic? The answer is Rule 2. Rule 2. Be ready when somebody says, "You tell me." Son, that's the goddamn ambush. This rule begins long before those words are ever spoken. It begins with preparation. Now, if you followed Rule 1, you've already read the sources, and you've already checked the evidence, and you've already tested your own assumptions. So when somebody says, "You tell me," it's not an ambush. It's now an invitation, because you're ready. Not because you've memorized every detail, because you've already done the work. Notice what Rule 2 is really asking. Carry your own burden. Don't ask questions you aren't prepared to defend. Don't expect somebody else to build your case for you. If you've made a claim, you should be able to explain why. And if you've questioned the claim, you should be able to explain what evidence led you there. That's not arrogance. That's responsibility. But here's the important part. If somebody shifts the burden, don't panic. Don't bluff. Don't invent. Go back to your evidence. If your position is built on receipts, you don't need perfect recall. You need an honest process. And that's what Rule 2 protects. Now compare the two. The tactic shifts the burden. Rule 2 accepts responsibility for your own. The tactic, it tests your confidence, but Rule 2 tests your preparation. The tactic hopes that you'll panic, and Rule 2 assumes you've already done the work. One turns the conversation into a performance. The other turns it back into an investigation. One asks, "Can you answer right now?" And the other asks, "Have you already verified your position?" Those are very different questions, and preparation doesn't guarantee you'll remember every detail. It does mean you'll know where your evidence came from and where to find it again. And that's why Rule 2 isn't about winning debates, it's about refusing to outsource your homework. If somebody ever looks at you and says, "You tell me," don't take it as an attack. See it as a test, not of your intelligence, not of your confidence, of your preparation. If you followed Rule 1, Rule 2 becomes remarkably calm. You've already done the work. Now you simply explain it. Carry your own burden, or bring your own receipts. And when it's your turn to speak, speak from evidence, not memory. That is Rule 2. Now, let's go to Tactic 3. Sometimes a claim is challenged, and evidence is requested, and instead of answering, the conversation goes somewhere else. A different politician, a different election, a different country. A different scandal, a different century even. The original claim quietly disappears beneath a growing pile of unrelated conversations. This tactic has many names: changing the subject, moving the goalposts, whataboutism, red herrings. They aren't identical, but they all achieve the same result. Attention moves, evidence doesn't. It's an incredibly effective tactic because human beings naturally follow movement. We're curious creatures. Our brains enjoy novelty, a fresh accusation, a new controversy, another rabbit hole. Before long, everyone is discussing something, except the original claim. And that's the goal. Not necessarily to prove anything, simply to prevent resolution. If the conversation never stays in one place long enough, nothing ever has to be demonstrated. And confusion begins to feel like complexity. But complexity isn't the same thing as evidence. So how do we never fall victim to those tactics? Well, the answer is Rule 3. Rule 3. Ignore the deflection. Notice what this rule does not say. It doesn't tell you to ignore new evidence. It doesn't tell you to ignore legitimate corrections. It doesn't tell you to ignore genuinely related information. Good investigations follow evidence wherever it leads, but Rule 3 is much simpler. Stay with the original claim until it's been answered. If somebody introduces a completely different topic, acknowledge it, then come back. If somebody says, "What about this?" you can simply say, "We'll get there." Right now, we're still waiting for the evidence supporting the original claim. That's not avoiding the question. It's refusing to abandon one before it's finished. A conversation can only investigate one claim at a time, and Rule 3 protects that focus. Now compare the two. The tactic changes the subject, and Rule 3 changes nothing. The tactic keeps opening new doors. Rule 3 quietly closes them until the first room has been searched. The tactic multiplies conversations, and Rule 3 completes one conversation before beginning another. One relies on distraction, and the other relies on discipline. One asks you to chase, and the other asks you to stay still. That's why Rule 3 feels so calm. You don't have to answer every new accusation. You simply remember why the conversation started. Whenever a conversation suddenly changes direction, ask yourself one question. Has the original claim actually been answered? If the answer is no, stay there. Don't chase, don't wander. Don't collect unfinished arguments like souvenirs. Finish the first investigation, then move to the second, then the third. One claim, one body of evidence, one conclusion. That's Rule 3. Tactic 4. A claim has been made. Questions have been asked. The conversation has stayed on topic. Now something interesting happens. The evidence never arrives. Instead, you get confidence, conviction, emotion, stories, insults, credentials, popularity, authority, and volume. Anything except the one thing the claim actually requires: evidence. This tactic survives because confidence is persuasive. Human beings are social creatures, and we're wired to notice certainty. If someone sounds absolutely convinced, part of our brain wants to assume that they know something we don't. But confidence doesn't make a claim true. Neither does passion or outrage or even charisma. A person can believe something with every fiber of their being and still be mistaken. That's why every investigation eventually reaches the same point. Not how certain are you, but what can you demonstrate? So, how do we never fall victim to those tactics? The answer is Rule 4. Rule 4, bring the receipts. Or, if you're asking someone else to support their claim, present your evidence. Those two phrases mean the same thing. One applies to you, the other applies to everyone else. Notice what this rule doesn't ask for. It doesn't ask for confidence or popularity or how many followers someone has, or even whether the claim feels right. It asks one simple question: what evidence supports the claim? Maybe that's a document or a data set or a video. Maybe it's an original source or like a scientific paper. The form, it doesn't matter. The evidence does. If a claim can be demonstrated, let's examine it. If it can't, then confidence isn't enough. Rule 4 keeps every investigation anchored to something that can actually be inspected. Because evidence can be checked, confidence can't. Now compare the two. The tactic asks you to trust the speaker, but Rule 4 asks to inspect the evidence. The tactic rewards certainty, but Rule 4 rewards verification. Once more, the tactic measures conviction, but let's go to Rule 4. It measures support. One says believe me and the other says show me. One relies on persuasion and the other relies on demonstration, and that's why Rule 4 is so powerful. It quietly changes the entire conversation, not who sounds the most convincing, but who can actually support what they're saying. Whenever somebody makes an important claim, don't ask yourself whether they seem sincere. Ask yourself something much simpler. What evidence supports this? If the evidence asks, examine it. If the evidence doesn't exist, no amount of certainty can replace it, because in the end, claims are cheap. Evidence does the heavy lifting. Bring the receipts, and when someone asks you to believe something extraordinary, there's only one response: present your evidence. Tactic 5. Something curious happens when evidence is requested. Sometimes nothing. Sometimes no documents, no source, no demonstration, just silence. For many people, silence is uncomfortable. We instinctively want to rescue the conversation, clarify our question, offer another explanation, lower the standard, move on. Anything to make the awkwardness disappear, and that's exactly why silence can become a tactic. Not because silence proves anything, because people often rush to escape it. The longer the pause, the greater the temptation to fill it yourself. Before long, you've started answering your own questions, making their argument for them, or quietly abandoning the request altogether. The claim survives, not because it was supported, because nobody waited long enough to notice that it wasn't. So how do we never fall victim to that tactic? Well, the answer is simple. Rule 5. Rule 5. Wait for the counterclaim. This rule asks for something surprisingly difficult: patience. If you've asked someone to support a claim, you've already done your part. Now wait. If evidence exists, give them the opportunity to present it. If a correction exists, give them the opportunity to offer it. If a counter-argument exists, listen to it, but don't rush to rescue the conversation. Don't weaken your own question because silence feels uncomfortable. A request for silence doesn't become unreasonable simply because it hasn't been answered yet. Rule 5 isn't about winning by waiting. It's about allowing the evidence, or lack of it, to reveal itself. Sometimes the strongest thing you can say is nothing at all. You've already done the hard work. You followed Rule 1 and survived Rule 2. Now compare the two. The tactic relies on discomfort, whereas Rule 5 relies on patience. The tactic hopes that you'll blink first, and Rule 5's perfectly comfortable waiting. The tactic counts on momentum, and Rule 5 removes the urgency. One says keep talking, and the other says the question is still waiting. One fills the silence, and the other lets the silence do its work, because silence isn't evidence, but it often reveals where evidence should have been. The next time you ask someone to support an important claim, resist the urge to keep talking. You've already asked the question, now give it room. If evidence exists, it can be presented. If it doesn't, silence will eventually tell its own story. Patience isn't weakness, it's confidence that the truth does not need rescuing. Ask your question, wait for the counterclaim, and if none comes, don't invent one. That's Rule 5. Tactic 6. Sometimes, even after you've asked your questions, stayed on topic, requested the evidence, and waited patiently, the evidence still doesn't appear. Instead, the conversation begins to loop. You hear the same confidence and the same certainty, the same stories and distractions, the same emotional appeals over and over again, without ever reaching the one thing that matters: evidence. At this point, many people give up. not because the claim has been supported, because they're exhausted. The tactic isn't proving the claim, it's wearing you down. If the conversation becomes tiring enough, people often stop asking questions, not because they were answered, because they no longer have the energy to keep asking. Persistence can become a tactic, not persistence in seeking truth, persistence in avoiding it. So how do we never fall victim to those tactics? The answer is Rule 6. Rule 6. Present your evidence, repeat as necessary. Notice that this rule doesn't tell you to repeat. Not your opinion, not your frustration, not your insults, just your request. Present your evidence, and if the conversation changes, return to the request. If somebody attacks your character, return to the request. Repeat until bored. If somebody becomes louder, exact same thing, or if tells another story, just stay there. Rule 6 isn't stubbornness, it's consistency. You've already done the preparation, you've already accepted responsibility for your own position, you've stayed focused, you've asked for evidence, you've waited. Now stay there until evidence arrives or it becomes obvious that it isn't coming. It's at this moment that you can have a little bit of fun. Do a little trolling, if you will. You know, you can say things like, that was an impressive quantity of nouns, or perhaps something like, an admirable performance, shame about the substance. Perhaps even something like, evidence appears to cause you considerable discomfort. You can have a little fun at this point, because you've earned it. You've survived step 1, and you've survived step 2. Now compare the two. The tactic hopes you'll eventually give up. Rule 6 simply refuses to leave the question unanswered. The tactic relies on exhaustion, and Rule 6 relies on consistency. The tactic repeats assertions, and Rule 6 repeats the request for evidence. One keeps talking about around the claim. The other quietly returns to it, again, and again, and again. Not because repetition creates truth, because unanswered questions don't answer themselves. The request never changes. Present your evidence. Every rule you've learned leads here. Prepare. Carry your own burden. Ignore the deflection. Bring the receipts. Wait for the counterclaim. And when all that has been done, there's only one thing left to say. Present your evidence. Repeat as many times as necessary. Not because you're trying to win, not because you're trying to embarrass someone, because extraordinary claims deserve support. And unsupported claims don't become stronger through repetition. Only evidence settles questions. Everything else is noise, and that's Rule 6. Over 500 years ago, Niccolò Machiavelli wrote one of the most influential books on power ever published, The Prince. Not because he invented manipulation, because he described it. He understood that uncertainty, identity, emotion, perception, and distraction could shape human behavior long before psychology became a science. Kings studied him, politicians quoted him, dictators borrowed from him, advertisers rediscovered him, influencers reinvented him. His tactics survived because human nature hasn't changed. But here's the important part. Neither has our ability to recognize those tactics. That's what these rules are for, not to tell you what to believe, not to tell you who to trust, not to tell you who deserves your vote. These rules don't choose your conclusions, they choose your process. And that's a crucial difference. Because manipulation doesn't care what your politics are. It doesn't care where you come from, and it doesn't care whether you're left, right, rich, poor, religious, atheist, young, or old. It only asks one question. Can you be influenced without noticing? The rules answer with 6 questions of their own. Did I prepare? Am I ready to explain my position? Are we still talking about the same claim? Where's the evidence? Have I given the evidence time to appear? And if it still hasn't, present your evidence. Repeat as necessary. That's why these rules matter. Not because they make manipulation impossible. Nothing can do that, but because they make manipulation much, much harder. Machiavelli taught generations how to influence works. The rules teach ordinary people how to recognize it. One studies power, the other studies verification, and when influence meets verification, verification wins every single time. Not because it's louder, not because it's cleverer, because reality doesn't negotiate, evidence does. Or it doesn't. So the next time somebody makes an extraordinary claim, don't panic, don't chase, don't guess, don't surrender your standards, simply smile and say the 3 words that every unsupported claim eventually runs into. Present your evidence. If you enjoyed this video, give it a like, a subscribe, ring the bell so you don't miss the next lesson. And if you think somebody else could use these tools, share it with them. Media literacy grows one conversation at a time. Until then, recognize the pattern, follow the receipts, present your evidence. We'll see you later. Go to skipfranzjr.net for podcasts.
Record player that, I could just spin records all the time.
Run into the bathroom and I'm covered in blood. Like I had put my tooth through my bottom lip.
For music, for gaming and pro-liberty game rants, that's skipfranzjr.net.